Hello everyone, thanks for coming outside with me today. Today I would like to talk about my arrow tuning process from A to Z, starting with an uncut bare shaft, getting all the nocks and other point components into it, shooting it through paper as a bare shaft, getting that tune set, fletching them up, and getting them ready for the field. There are lots of ins and outs of this, and I'm going to try to cover as much as I possibly can, but if I do forget anything, if you do have any questions, do leave a comment, follow the links in the description below, hit me up on Facebook, Instagram, you can even send me an email if I've left any questions for you or if you have anything else further that I didn't already touch on. This video is going to be pretty inclusive when it comes to arrows, both carbon and aluminum, and if you know a lot of this already, I will try to put time tags over here. You can skip to that particular part of the video that you are more interested in, but if you want to stick around for the whole thing, here we go. So first, let's talk about carbon and aluminum arrows. We're going to skip over wood. That's very specific for traditional bow hunters who shoot recurves and longbows. You can't shoot a wooden arrow out of a modern compound. It would break the arrow, ultimately break your bow, and potentially cause injury to you and bystanders around you. So you're really down to carbon and aluminum shafts. Both carbon and aluminum are very viable options out of today's compounds and recurves as well, and they both have their pros and cons. Now, when it comes to tuning both of these arrows, the process is the same with the exception of one step. So let's talk about building an aluminum arrow first. An aluminum arrow is constructed in the same way that an aluminum can is constructed. Obviously there are differences, but if you've ever seen an aluminum can get created for a beverage of some sort, soda pop or other things, you'll know that it starts out as a disc and then gets stretched out, gets pulled out. And the same thing roughly happens to an aluminum arrow. What that means is this is a continuous piece of aluminum and it is the same from end to end. What that means is the spine consistency is incredible. Now, for those of you that might not know what spine refers to the deflection of the shaft. When that bow pushes on the arrow, it is going to flex either one way or the other, and depending on how much or how little that arrow flexes is a particular number. So for aluminum shafts, this is represented by a 4-digit number. This is a 2315, and that refers to, the first number refers to the overall diameter of the shaft, and the second number refers to the thickness of the interior wall. So if you have a big diameter and a thick wall, it's going to make this arrow really stiff. So this is a 2315. That's a pretty good sized diameter and a pretty thick wall. So this is a 330-ish spine, which is pretty stiff for today's arrow standards. Now back to that whole seam thing. Since this arrow is constructed in a tube and there's no seam, that means the entire way around this arrow, the spine is the same. And this is going to come down the road later when it gets to tuning. But tuning an aluminum arrow doesn't matter which way you position it. So you could shoot with this vein up or the next vein up or the next vein up. It's going to react exactly the same. That's not true with carbon arrows, and let's talk about them. So this Easton XX75 Camo Hunter is seamless, meaning that it is completely the same in its spine. Whereas this Gold Tip XT Hunter here, this is a wrapped or round carbon shaft, which means there is a seam in here somewhere because it's wrapped upon itself, which means you get a side, doesn't matter, I don't know which side specifically, one side could be stiffer than the other. If you want a little bit more in-depth on what this looks, I'll put a link in the description below to Sam White's YouTube channel. He does an excellent job reviewing arrows. He has a lot of really cool diagrams and it can explain this in a little bit more detail than I'm going to in this video. But for the purpose of carbon arrows, we have to think that there could be a stiff side somewhere because of that extra wrap, because where that seam is, and a weaker side somewhere where that extra wrap or seam doesn't exist, which means that if I turn this arrow one way or the other, it could react differently. Now, the spine is still within its range. In this case, this is a 300 spine arrow, so the overall average is going to be a 300 spine, but I could have one part that's stiffer, say like a 295, which would be a little bit stiffer, and I could have one part that's weaker, say a 305, so I have a little bit of variance there, and depending on where that seam is and how this nock gets clipped on a string and how it gets pushed off the bow, a different batch of arrows could respond differently based on that seam. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we go to tune later. So there are two schools of thought when it comes to tuning an arrow. You can either tune the arrow to your bow or you can tune the bow to the arrow. Now I personally like the latter method. I'd rather take my bow because I have the necessary tools in order to tune my bow to my arrow, but it's not that difficult. Even if you don't have a bow press and you don't have a draw board, you can still get your arrow to be tuned to the bow based on your bow actually being tuned to the arrow. There are lots of things you can do to an arrow in order to tune it to a particular bow. So for those of you that shoot recurves or shoot longbows, you don't have all the cams and all the different cables and the limb poundage and all this different stuff that you can fiddle with in order to make this arrow fly out of your bow correctly. You really only can change the arrow. So when it comes to tuning an arrow for a recurve or a longbow, some sort of traditional setup, the longer the arrow is, the more it is able to flex. The more point weight you put on the front, the more it will flex the shaft. The less point weight, obviously, it'll deflect less, and the shorter it gets, it obviously flex less. So depending on the poundage of your recurve or longbow, how long you draw the bow, how much point weight you put on the front, how much center shot you have on your bow, the more close to center your bow, your arrow can rest, closer to the riser itself, the stiffer shaft you can get away with. The further away it moves from the shelf, the weaker shaft you're going to need. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know all the ins and outs of traditional archery. It's not really my cup of tea, but those are the basics. And the same still is true for a compound setup. The further you move it away from the riser, the weaker it's going to be. The closer you move it, the stiffer it's going to be. Same thing's true with the length. The longer it is, the more it's able to flex. The shorter it is, the less it's able to flex. The more weight you put at the front, it's easier to flex. The lighter at the front, it's harder to flex. So I don't care what manufacturer you shoot. I shoot Easton aluminum arrows. I shoot gold tips for my carbons for hunting. Every manufacturer is really producing high quality arrows these days. It's really an awesome time to be in the archery world. Now, this gold tip arrow I've had great success with, and I've had great success tuning it. So I will recommend them to people, but you can shoot Carbon Express, you can shoot Easton. There's a lot of different brands on the market, but we're going to be specifically tuning this gold tip today. So since we're talking about compound and I'm going to tune my bow to the arrow, I like to just get my arrow the way I want it to be. So this is my 3D arrow. This arrow is cut to 29 inches long. And you measure that by going from the deepest part of the throat of the nock to the end of the carbon. Don't measure the point, just to the end of the carbon. And that is 29 inches long. Like I said earlier, this is a 300 spine arrow. And how I was able to figure out that length and that spine that I would need for my particular setup, which is a 60-pound bow at a 30-inch draw, I just went onto Gold Tip's manufacturer website, looked at their spine chart, and every major manufacturer will have that. So find the manufacturer you want to shoot, pick that particular arrow, go onto their website or find a manual somewhere online, find the spine for the length of arrow that you want. Now, not only are you going to need to know the length of the arrow and the poundage and draw length of your bow, but you're also going to want to know how much weight you want to put at the front. Because remember, the more weight you add up here, the more it's going to flex this arrow. So if you add a whole bunch of weight, you might actually need to go up in spine and make this stiffer so that way it doesn't come out of your bow too weak. Now, real quickly about that, when it comes to an arrow being too weak out of your bow, it's not really dangerous unless you're shooting many spines that are way too soft for your bow, like a 600 spine shaft out of a 70-pound bow or a 500 spine shaft out of a 70-pound bow. It's really hard to cause a problem. Really, you're just going to have issues with arrow flight and tuning. Your bow is going to be loud, it's going to be inefficient, and it's just not the best setup for you. So know how much point weight you want, know how much arrow length you want, and know the poundage and draw length of your bow. Go onto your manufacturer website, and they'll be able to recommend a particular shaft and a particular spine for you. So now that I have this arrow, this is what I'm going to be shooting, I now can start putting it onto my bow, taking some shots there, and being able to figure out how to best tune this arrow and actually tune my bow to the specific arrow, because this is done. This is the full manufactured product. So now that I have the arrow figured out, I now need to worry about my actual bow. This is an Elite Energy 35. Like I said, about a 30-inch draw, a little bit longer, and 60 pounds. So that's going to work out just fine. But now I need to worry about my rest, and I need to worry about the bubble on my sight housing. If your sight housing doesn't have a bubble, you're going to be careful. Make sure you watch if you're tilting the bow. If you are tilting the bow and inconsistently tilting the bow one way or the other, it's going to throw your arrow tune off a little bit. So make sure that you are consistently, I don't care if your bubble's level, you could sit with it like this. You can tune a bow like this or like this. It's obviously best to tune it straight up and down, but you have to make sure you factor in that human part. You have to factor in the fact that you are shooting this bow, you are shooting this arrow setup, and what tunes for you probably won't tune for somebody else. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you do this and you do it correctly and you do it effectively for you. So I've worked on a lot of different bows in my lifetime from a lot of different companies, and I've never once seen a bow company not recommend 13/16 for center shot as a starting point. What that means is the center of my rest, in this case this is a blade rest, this is a Trophy Ridge blade rest, and from the center of this V on this blade to the burger buttonhole, which is where your rest bolts into the riser, that distance is approximately 13/16 of an inch. So I'll take a tape measure, stick that on, and I'll move the rest in and out until I'm roughly in there. It doesn't have to be perfect, you're going to be moving it anyway, but just so you have a rough estimate. A lot of people will like to go down the center of the string, or they'll go off the limb bolts or off their stabilizer mount, but the problem is, and you can see it on this bow, the center of this cam is not in the center of this limb. The string track is actually on the left-hand side, so that's going to put my rest on the more outward side. So don't go off of your string because it's probably not going to be in the center of the limb. If it is in the center of the limb, that's awesome, but it's not a guarantee. So always go off what the manufacturer recommends. In this case, Elite recommends 13/16 from the riser as a good starting point. In conjunction from 13/16 from the riser, you also want to have your arrow running through the burger buttonhole at a 90-degree angle to the string. That's a good starting point. So you could take some levels and try to bubble it off that way. Really, the easiest thing to do is just kind of eyeball it. Take an arrow, take the arrow that you just built, for example, clip it onto the string, set it onto the rest, and now this is a blade rest, so the weight of the arrow is kind of pushing it down a little bit. But I know from my tuning experience that if I just kind of lift up on it a little bit, I can see what it would be at full draw, and I can see that the arrow would be running right through the burger buttonhole. Now, like I said, this is not a perfect system. It's not going to possibly be right dead center. It might be a little bit low, might be a little bit high. It all depends, again, on you. It depends on the arrow and how the bow's going to shoot. But that's a great place to start. 13/16, arrow running dead center through the burger buttonhole. Now, another important thing to do, and this is why I personally like to tune the bow to the arrow, is you're going to want to make sure your bow is in spec according to the manufacturer. So this Elite Energy 35 should be approximately 34 3/4 inches from the axle pin to the axle pin that goes right through the cam, and the brace height should be a given distance. If those aren't set, you should take it to a bow shop if you don't have a bow press and have them put it into spec for you. You also want to have them check the timing of the cam, which means when this rolls over and the bottom cam rolls over, that these limb stops are touching the underside of the limb at the same time. Certain bow systems, this will roll over and it'll touch the control cable or the bus cable at the same time, depending on the make of the bow. It'll have what's known as a cable stop, and that will come and push into the string. You want to make sure it's pushing into the cable, both top and bottom simultaneously. A draw board is really helpful here, but you can also put an arrow onto the string, pull it back, and have somebody look at it for you while you draw the bow back slowly. So if it's not in time, you know, for example, let's say this cam hits here before the bottom cam. What that means is that this cam is actually over rotating. It's coming in too hot, and this one's coming in too slow. And so when they roll back, when the shot actually occurs, this one here is actually going to be behind because it's actually further rotated than this one on the bottom. So this one's going to hit first. It's going to cause the bottom part of the string to hit part of the brace first here. It's probably going to come in contact with the string stop, and your arrow might fly off at an erratic angle. The same thing's true with the top. If this comes in faster, it's going to again hit from the top faster, cause erratic arrow flight potentially. So it's really important to make sure your bow is set into spec. And this is true whether you really tune the arrow to the bow or the bow to the arrow. Your bow should really be in spec. It's not that hard. You can do it with a simple Bowmaster bow press that you can get online. I'll put links to that in the description below. If you want to have a full-fledged bow press like I do, like a Last Chance Archery Easy Green, that'll also work. But having your bow in time and tune is not that difficult. Your pro shop won't charge you probably more than $20-30 to have it done. You really only need to have it done once or twice a year for the vast majority of us archers. You know, I do it all the time because I'm always constantly fiddling around with things. But this string cable set here, I put this on right before hunting season several months ago. I shot the string cables in, timed it up, and I have not had to move it since. And I've put several hundred shots through this bow. The string cables of today are just super high quality, and it's just not going to move around nearly as much as they did of many, many years ago. So get your bow in time, get it tuned, get it done appropriately at a local pro shop, or if you have the ability to do it yourself, and it'll make this arrow tuning process a heck of a lot easier down the road. So now I have the arrow built to exactly the way I want it. I have my bow set up the way it should be according to the manufacturer's recommendations. I have my rest at that 13/16, arrow running through the burger buttonhole. My cams are in sync. Everything's done. I'm now ready to start tuning this arrow. And the way I like to do it is by shooting a bare shaft. No fletchings. You can shoot a fletch shaft through paper if you want to skip the bare shaft part, but in my personal opinion, if you want to get an arrow that's flying super duper well, whether it's for hunting, 3D, indoor, or field archery, and really just even shooting around the backyard, it's super simple if you're patient to do a bare shaft tune correctly, and you can get your fletch shafts flying perfectly. You can get them flying together, believe it or not, even though this doesn't have any fletchings on it. So when it comes to paper tuning, you can build a paper tuning stand and get all fancy. I didn't. This is an old muck boot box that I just simply cut an irregular rectangle out of, and I can tape a piece of 8.5 by 11 copier paper on the backside, and I'm able just to set this up down here in my basement, shoot it a couple feet, couple yards away. I actually have to do it either sitting or kneeling sometimes because I'm just too tall for my basement. You want to be able to shoot at the paper as close to level as possible, because think of this for a second. If you're going to shoot standing and your target's on the ground, your arrow is going to impact the paper at an angle, and it might cause a weird looking tear, right? And you don't want this. You want to be shooting as level to the paper as possible. So in this case, I'm going to set this paper stand up. I'm going to go sit down over here on the ground. We're going to take a few shots, and I want to show you some of the tears that we don't want and how do we fix them so we get that perfect bullet hole we're all looking for. So if you think this looks like I'm just sitting on the floor of a cluttered basement, this is a pretty sketchy paper tuning setup. It's because it is. I'm a dad and a husband first before I'm an archer, but at least I'm still able to get down here and enjoy myself a little bit. Now, back to live action. Paper set up here, we're about, maybe 6-7 feet away from the paper where I'm seated right now, and about 6-7 feet behind the paper is my target to stop the arrow. I want to make sure that my target is not so close that the arrow will impact the target before it has a chance to completely clear the paper. That's a very important thing, and I've made that mistake in the past and gotten a whole bunch of weird looking tears. It's because the arrow was impacting the target first. Now, full disclosure, I have completely tuned this setup already, so this hopefully will shoot a bullet hole for me already, which is the tune we're looking for. So when it comes to tuning a bare shaft, and particularly through paper, you don't want to be at 20 yards. Really, you want to be in this 6, 7, 8 foot range. This is where that arrow is coming off the bow in that first 10 feet. This is where you want the fletchings to not have to do any work. You want the arrow to be coming off straight, to be coming off clean, and then the fletchings immediately take over, and the arrow is going to fly perfectly the rest of the way of the target. If the bare shaft is wanting to go left or right or up or down, then the fletchings have to correct that over a certain length, and at short distance or in windy scenarios outside, that could cause some problems and cause some inaccuracy and some issues. So if it's coming off perfect in this first 10 feet, 12 feet at the most, then we're going to be good as rain. So let's clip it on here, and hopefully I don't screw this up. I'm going to make sure my bow is not canted again to the left or right. I'm watching my bubble, which I know is level because I used a level earlier off camera. And I'm going to shoot this through paper and see what kind of tear we get. That is a perfect bullet hole. Let's go up and take a look at that. So as you can see, that unfletched bare shaft, that is exactly, it literally looks like I shot a bullet through that paper. You don't see any tears. It is a perfect circle. So let me show you a shaft that is not tuned for this bow and the tear it would make and how ugly it would look and how we would rectify that tuning situation. Alright, so now I have an arrow that's a 340 spine. So it's actually a softer spine and it's longer. It's 30 inches, and just for fun I put a 125 grain point plus the 12 grain insert into the front. So this is going to be a weak arrow, which is going to give us a tear that we're not going to want. So let me shoot this through the paper here. And hopefully we get a real ugly tear that we never want to see, and what I would do to rectify it with the rest. It just shot a perfect bullet hole. I didn't see that coming. Let's go look at that. Well, let's gosh. Let's get a different arrow and see if we can get different results here. Well, apparently the archery gods have decided to have fun with me. This is a 400 spine. I think it's cut to 29 and a half, and I still put that 125 grain point. Let's see if we get a different tear here. I am still flabbergasted about the second shot there. There we go. That's the tear I wanted to see. Let's go check that one out.
All right, here's our first shot with that gold tip. Here's that second shot with that other 300 spine arrow, cut a little bit different. But this one is really what I was expecting to see the first time. So you see this is the bullet here. So this is where the point impacted, and then the shaft was coming in like this, and it tore the paper this way. So here's where the knock ended up. So this is known as a knock right tear. You could have the inverse, which would be a knock left tear, so the point would have impacted here, and the knock would have ended up coming through the paper over here. You could have a knock low, you can have a knock high, and of course you can have different variations of left and right combined. This is probably the best type when you see just a left-right issue. This is probably one of the easiest to rectify. If you get an up and down, you have some rest movement, and you could kind of run out of rest movement, but left and right, I'll play with this all day long. So let's talk about going back to that seam issue with that aluminum not having a seam and the carbon being built on a seam. Let's see if we can knock tune and get that tear to behave a little bit.
All right, so back to that seam and no seam on aluminum and carbon arrows. Because aluminum doesn't have a seam, it means no matter which side of the shaft you push on, it's going to deflect the same. Whereas a carbon shaft, because of that seam, you could have a different deflection. So that means you can do what's called knock tuning. And I've done this a lot. I have an older video on this, in fact. But what you can do is you can clip your knock onto the string, and I'll like to follow the crest of the arrow. So this is a Carbon Express, and what I'll do is, because the Carbon Express logo is over here, I will rotate this while it's clipped onto the string, and that'll turn the shaft around the knock. So I'll go in 90-degree increments. So I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. I'm going to put this Carbon Express logo, which is currently on the top, and I'm going to put it 90 degrees on the back side away from me. I'm going to take it, twist it on the string. I'm going to put that Carbon Express logo 90 degrees away from me. Now, what that could do, because I don't know where this seam is on this arrow, now I could be pushing on a different deflection of this shaft. Let's see, after I shoot this through paper, if that paper tear moves. I'm going to keep everything on my end the same. I'm going to keep my bubble level. I'm not going to cant the bow. I'm going to keep my grip exactly the same. I'm going to keep my release hand exactly the same. Now, here's the kicker. Now, I know that I have very consistent form. I've been shooting for a very long time. So I only shot one shaft through paper, and then I started fiddling around by knock tuning. You don't want to do that if you're first doing this whole knock tuning and this whole pear shaft and paper tuning experience. When you first do that shot, take that arrow out of the target and shoot it again. And then shoot it again, and make sure you're getting a consistent tear. If you shoot 3 shots and they're all like that with the point in the center and the knock going to the right, you know your form is consistent. If you get one where the knock's to the right, then it's up, and then it's down, and then it might be more left than it was right originally, that means you are not being consistent in your form. So if you start this whole process and you're not consistent, just stop. Sight in your bow, shoot your arrows, and just enjoy it for a while. Get consistent form built, because bare shaft tuning and paper tuning in general, even with a fletch shaft, is very fickle. And if you're not having consistent form, there's no point in frustrating pulling your hair out. Trust me, I've spent many years pulling my hair out because I didn't have consistent form. But I know I have consistent form now, so I rotated that shaft around the knock while it was clipped onto the string, 90 degrees. And let's shoot it, and let's see. I don't know. Let's see if this paper tears a little bit different. Hopefully it will. As I can see, nothing changed, so I might still be in the same seam. I'm going to rotate another 90 degrees and see if something changes. Another 90-degree rotation, another shot. Let's see if anything changes. So far I see that nothing is changing, so we have one more rotation to go, and if nothing changes, then I know for that arrow and for my rest and the rest of the dozen in my assortment, or half a dozen, however many shafts I purchase, I know that I have to do some rest adjustments, and that's an easy thing. Go one more rotation, so now we've taken that Carbon Express logo 270 degrees around, and if we don't see any change here, then we're going to move on to another arrow and see if it tears the same through paper. Yes, this is a long and monotonous process, but trust me, it's worth it in the end, and particularly if you really want to eke every ounce of accuracy you can out of your setup. Okay, so that last shot actually made a little bit of difference. So let's take the camera down, look at all 4 of these tears, and see if there's anything we need to adjust.
All right, so we have shot number 1, huge tear. Shot number 2, identical tear. Shot number 3, where we rotated it about 180 degrees, it gets a little bit shorter. And then the last one here, it's shorter yet. So this is actually the shortest tear we have. Now, this bow is not tuned to that 400 spine arrow, so it's actually a very weak arrow coming out of this bow. I expect to have a large, unsightly tear. And this is why it's so important to start with an arrow that matches your actual setup as per manufacturer recommendations. So now, let's say that I was shooting an arrow that was per manufacturer recommendations. You know, this was actually a 300 spine, and I was still getting this last final tear here. What I would do with the rest to move this, to rectify it, to get this perfect bullet hole that we see right here.
All right, so here we have our paper here with our 4 tears. Here is our first shot, here is our second shot, our third shot, and our fourth shot. Sorry, I'm left-handed. You're going to have to deal with my hand being in the way. But anyhow, here was our first one. Before we rotate anything, here was our first rotation, our second rotation, our third rotation of the arrow. This one was our best one. Now, we didn't have any changes in vertical, so no knock high, no knock low. So we don't have to worry about that. But let's say we did. Let's say this last one ended up with a tear that tore up this way. Okay, so this is what it would kind of look like through the paper. What this means is I would have to, my point would still be here, my knock would still be up here, which means my knock is coming in high and my point is coming in low. And I need to move the point up. So I would move my rest this way to bring my point in line with the knock on the arrow. Now, same thing is true of the inverse. If I was knock low and it was tearing down this way, my point would be high, my knock would be low, and I would have to move my rest down to try to get my point to match the knock. Now, you could also move your D-loop, but that's a little bit difficult. And it's really not fun to cut D-loops off and on and to get them level. That's why it's important to start level, get that arrow running perfectly dead center through the burger buttonhole, arrow 90 degrees from the string, so on and so forth. That'll really rectify these up and down issues that you see here. And that's simple for you to check at home. Now, let's talk about this left, and we'll come over here to demonstrate this one because I've already written all over that one. Point's right here, and the knock is over here. Now, when it comes to our vertical tear, we want to move the point in the direction we need it to go. So in this case, we need the point to move down to meet the knock. We need the point to move up in order to meet the knock up here. But when it comes to these left-right tears, this has to deal with how the arrow is flexing on the bow. These are just because it's set up and down wrong. These are actually end up flexing. So our arrow is flexing weirdly this way, which means it's kind of flexing in an outward direction this way. If it was rotated this way, the arrow would obviously be flexing the other way, and the knock would be coming out in this general direction. Okay? Since we have a knock right tear, we always need to follow the point. We chase the point of the arrow. So the point's on the left, the knock's on the right, which means, counterintuitively, I need to move my rest to chase the point. So in this case, my point's on the left, I would move my rest to the left away from the riser. If it was reversed, and it was this way, and my point was hitting on the right, and on the left side was my knock, I would chase the point this way, moving the rest closer to the riser there. Now, most of the time, you're going to end up actually probably, particularly with that super weak shaft, you'll end up with a tear that's really bad one way or the other, and that's, again, why it's so important to start with an arrow shaft that's correctly spined for your bow. It just makes life so much simpler. This is an egregious tear. This is over an inch, and this is really an indicator of a weak shaft. Most of the time, when you get a left-right tear like this, it'll start with the point here in the center, and you might get maybe ½ an inch tear to the right or a ½ inch tear or so to the left, and that you can easily move the rest. Something like this bad, this egregious, is really an indicator of a shaft that's way too stiff. You know, you're shooting a 300 when you should be shooting a 500, or really weak when you should be shooting a 300 and you're shooting a 500. So those are really the indicators there of these really bad tears. So again, when it comes to point impacting high and the knock impacting low, we would move the point down to meet the knock, and same thing true of the vertical. But when it comes to the point impacting left or right, we chase the point. So if the point's on the left, we chase it with the rest. If the point's on the right, we chase it with the rest. I will link how I knock tuned a particular shaft in another video that I did. It was a little live stream, and there was an instance where I shot the shaft, and here was the point, and it was really egregiously right. And then I did that rotation, and I found a different part of the scene, because then the next shot, it moved. and it got a little bit shorter. And then the next turn it moved and got shorter yet. And when I get to this point right here, this best shot, this is where I know this is where the best seam on that arrow is. And I do that for every single arrow. If I shoot a bunch of different arrows and one tears like this, one tears like this, one tears like this, and they consistently tear like that, it's not a grip issue, right? I talked about that earlier. It's a form issue if they're all tearing all different kinds of directions, but it's the same arrow. But if different arrows are tearing differently like this and they consistently, if you shoot an arrow like this 1, 2, 3 times and it tears like that, you shoot an arrow like this and again 1, 2, 3 times and it tears like that, you know that's that arrow's tear. And that's deliberately what it is. If these two shafts are the same shafts, same length, same weight, same deflection, same spine, and they tear like this differently and they consistently do it, you know it's not your form, it's the arrow. And that's where that knock tune, that twisting the arrow 90 degrees each time and trying to get it to come around and find that perfect seam. Once you get all your arrows tearing exactly the same, be it this, this, or this guy over here, now you know you can move your rest and you can follow these instructions over here. Oh boy, that was a lot of information here, but we do have one more step and then we'll recap and try to make sense of all this. The last thing, and particularly when it comes to that knock tuning and you're twisting that shaft while the knock is on the string, 90 degrees for each shot, and you're trying to find that seam. Once you find it, don't lose it. Take a Sharpie, and yeah, you're going to have to mark up your knock and mark up your shaft a little bit. Take your shaft and take your knock. I don't care which side. You can go down the throat. You can go down. I like to go off the Nock Indexer. And the Nock Indexer, on every different style of knock, there'll be a little plastic tab, either out towards the ends where it clips onto the string or down closer to the base where it makes contact with the shaft. And I will mark with a Sharpie, either a silver or a black Sharpie, I will mark the knock and I will mark the shaft right there so I know when I go to fletch these that I can line up this knock with this part of the shaft, and that's exactly where it should be flying each and every time it comes out of the bow. You'll have to play around with a fletching jig if you fletch your own arrows, and if you want to make it best that way, you'll have to play around with how you want your angles so that way when you rotate the knock it comes back to that place perfectly. But once you have that, you know you have an arrow that is perfectly flying out of your bow, and long before it's able to do anything, your fletchings are able to take over. It's flying so true and so perfect, and you will have the best tuned arrow that's ever come out of that bow. So let's quickly run down through the steps once more. Pick your shaft, go to your manufacturer's website, pick the spine, deflection, and length and point weight that you want. Once you've decided on that, cut it to the length, install your components. Then set your bow to manufacturer's recommendations. Your rest at 13/16, arrow dead center through the burger buttonhole, 90 degrees to the string. Then make sure your cams are in time and that the poundage is exactly the way you want it, the draw length is exactly the way you want it. Once you're ready for that, shoot it through paper as level as possible. Don't shoot it down into it. Don't shoot it up into it. Try to get as level as possible so you can get the best results possible. Once you shoot that arrow through paper, whether it's carbon or aluminum, rotate the knock if it's carbon, if it has a really bad tear. Now you should be close. If you're shooting a manufacturer's recommended spine and length and point weight and all that sort of stuff, you should be pretty darn close. And then if it's close and you don't have to knock tune, all you have to do is move the rest. Again, if it's a vertical issue, either bring the point up or bring the point down to bring it in line with the knock. If it's a left-right issue and the point is impacting one way and the knock's coming in the other, move your rest to chase the point. Don't ask me why. That's just how the arrow tunes out. That's a totally different conversation for a totally different time. Once you get that all set up and it's shooting as perfect to a near bullet hole as possible, don't pull your hair out. If it's not a perfect bullet hole like you saw earlier in the video, do not panic. Get it close. The closer it is, the better your fletchings are going to be at stabilizing and taking that arrow perfectly downrange. Do not lose your mind trying to get that perfect, precise 22 caliber size bullet hole through the paper. If it's super close, be happy with it. You'll be shooting an arrow, I'll guarantee you, that's 90% better than any other type of arrow that most bow hunters are shooting on the market today. Now, one last thing. What if you're already shooting pre-fletched shafts? You buy them from your local big box store, you buy them online. What if they already have fletchings? Well, the same rules apply. Make sure it's the exact spine, the length, all that sort of stuff is the way it's supposed to be. Your bow is in tune. But now you don't have the 90 degrees, right? Because your fletchings are going to contact your riser or your rest. Now you only have 3 positions. In most arrows, they're fletched with one off color. Now, I like to run all white, but the representation's still the same. So I'll run this vein up, then I can twist the knock leave the nock where it is on the string, twist the shaft around it, run this vein up. Then I can twist it one more time and run this vein up. And eventually one's going to probably behave for you. And when it's there, leave it there. Don't strip the fletchings off. Don't go back to bare shaft if you don't have to. If the arrow behaves, it's fine. Paper tuning a fletch shaft is exactly like paper tuning a bare shaft. Again, point left, chase it left. Point right, chase the rest right. Up, down, it's all exactly the same. Now you just have fletchings. You're still at the same distance, about that 6 to 10 feet. And if you know if it's coming out straight there, it's going to be coming out straight 20 yards down the range. I know there's a lot of information, and if you have any questions for me, hit me up on the YouTube comment section, Facebook, Instagram, send me an email. I don't care. I absolutely love it when people send me questions. I love helping out as many people as I can. There's no such thing as a dumb beginner question. We all have to start somewhere. Hope you're able to get outside, enjoy the sport of archery hunting if you so choose. Definitely enjoy God's beautiful creation. Don't pull your hair out trying to bare shaft tune. Enjoy it. Enjoy the process. Take your time. Go slow. And we'll get to see you next time.